My in-laws were always dismissive of me as I was a house husband and compared me to their working son. But when they needed help, reality hit them hard. I still remember the first time I met my in-laws. It was during a family dinner at their house, 2 months into my relationship with Lauren. Her father, Richard, was a stern, no-nonsense man in his late 50s, built like a former athlete who refused to let go of his prime. Her mother, Eleanor, was elegant but cold, always impeccably dressed, with that stiff smile that never quite reached her eyes. They were the picture of wealth and status, an affluent couple who measured success in job titles, paychecks, and social circles. And then there was me, a former marketing executive turned house husband. I had quit my corporate job by choice after Lauren and I got married. She was a thriving pediatric surgeon with a demanding schedule, and we both wanted stability for our future family. When we decided to have children, it made sense that one of us would stay home. Given Lauren's successful and fulfilling career, the decision was easy. I became the one to manage the household, take care of our daughter, Lily, and handle the day-to-day responsibilities. It was a role I embraced with pride. I loved being present for Lily's milestones, her first steps, her first words. I found genuine joy in making our house a home. I cooked, cleaned, and organized every detail of our lives so Lauren could focus on saving lives. It was a partnership that worked perfectly for us, but not for my in-laws. From the moment they learned I was a stay-at-home husband, they treated me with thinly veiled contempt. During that first dinner, Richard's lips had thinned slightly when I mentioned I no longer worked. Eleanor's eyes flickered with poorly hidden disappointment. And then came the comments. Subtle at first. So, you're between jobs right now? Eleanor asked, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. When I explained that it was a conscious decision, she smiled tightly and nodded as if I were delusional. Later that night, as Lauren and Eleanor were in the kitchen, I overheard Richard speaking to his son, Patrick, Lauren's younger brother. The guy doesn't even have a job, Richard muttered under his breath. Lauren could have married someone more ambitious. Someone like you. Patrick. The golden child. He was an investment banker with a 6-figure salary, a sleek sports car, and a high-rise apartment in the city. To Richard and Eleanor, he was the embodiment of success. I was merely the man who lived off their daughter's income. I didn't say anything. Not then. I smiled politely, took their condescension in stride, and pushed it all aside for Lauren's sake. After all, she loved me for who I was, not for how much money I made. That was all that mattered, or so I thought. As the years passed, their attitude toward me never changed. Every holiday, every family gathering, it was the same routine. Patrick would arrive in his designer suits, flashing his latest watch, while Richard and Eleanor showered him with praise. So hardworking, so driven, such a provider. Then, the comparisons would start. Oh, Patrick, did you see the market trends? You could easily double your investment in a month. Eleanor would gush. Then her eyes would flicker to me. Henry. Do you still cook? Her tone always carried that condescending lilt, as if managing a household was some childish hobby. At Christmas dinners, Richard would talk about the importance of men being providers while pointedly avoiding eye contact with me. Patrick's promotion would be celebrated with expensive whiskey and congratulations. Meanwhile, my home-cooked meals were dismissed with half-hearted nods. There were nights when I would lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if it would ever change. Wondering if they would ever see me as more than just the man who vacuumed their daughter's floor. But I stayed silent. For Lauren. For Lily. Because our little family was my entire world, and I wasn't going to let their disapproval taint it. It happened unexpectedly on a rainy afternoon. I was in the kitchen, kneading dough for fresh bread, while Lily sat at the table coloring in her sketchbook. The house smelled faintly of garlic and rosemary from the pot of stew simmering on the stove. It was a typical cozy day, until my phone rang. It was Lauren. Her voice was unusually tense. "Henry, it's my parents. There was an accident." My heart clenched. She explained that Richard had suffered a bad fall at home. He had fractured his hip and was rushed to the hospital. In the chaos, Eleanor, frantic and disoriented, had slipped and sprained her wrist. Both of them were in bad shape, and with Patrick away on a business trip, there was no one available to help them, no one but me. I didn't hesitate. I packed an overnight bag, called a neighbor to watch Lily, and drove straight to the hospital. When I arrived, Eleanor was sitting in the waiting room, her wrist wrapped in a splint. Her eyes were red and puffy, her face pale and weary. For the first time, she looked fragile, far removed from the dignified, untouchable woman I was so used to. She glanced up at me, clearly surprised to see me. "Henry?" Her voice was weak, confused. I knelt beside her and placed my hand over hers. "It's okay," I said softly. "I'm here." For the next 3 weeks, I moved into their house. Richard had been discharged but was still heavily dependent on assistance. He couldn't walk without support. Eleanor's wrist was healing, but she couldn't do simple tasks like cooking or cleaning. They were both utterly helpless. So, I took over. I cooked every meal from scratch, just as I did for Lauren and Lily. I prepared soups rich with vegetables, grilled lean meats, and baked soft, homemade bread. I adjusted the seasonings carefully to cater to Richard's restricted diet. I cleaned their house meticulously, changed the bedsheets, and washed their clothes. I helped Richard bathe, dressed his wounds, and gently guided him with his physical therapy exercises. I sat with Eleanor at night when she couldn't sleep, offering her tea in a patient ear when she needed to vent about the accident. I even handled their finances, paying bills, organizing their medical paperwork, and liaising with their insurance company. The man they once dismissed as just a house husband was suddenly their lifeline. It didn't take long for reality to hit them hard. One night, as I was helping Richard into bed, he suddenly gripped my arm. His voice was hoarse and uneven. "Henry," he said quietly, his voice cracking. "I don't know what we would have done without you." I glanced down at him, startled. The man who once openly mocked me for not working was staring at me with genuine gratitude. The hostility in his eyes was gone, replaced with humility. Later that week, Eleanor limped into the kitchen as I was cleaning up after dinner. She stood there awkwardly for a moment, watching me dry the dishes. I expected her usual curt, dismissive tone, but instead, she spoke softly. "Thank you," she whispered. "For everything." I turned, surprised. Her eyes were glossy with emotion. The woman who once sneered at my house husband title was now looking at me with genuine vulnerability. The day Patrick finally returned was gloomy, with gray clouds hanging low in the sky and a steady drizzle tapping against the windows. I was in the kitchen preparing lunch when I heard the sound of a car door slamming in the driveway. A sleek black Mercedes pulled up in front of the house, and out stepped Patrick, dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, his tie perfectly knotted, and his leather shoes polished to a mirror shine. His designer luggage clattered against the stone path as he strolled toward the front door. I peered out the window, quietly observing him as he adjusted his cufflinks with that signature cocky smirk. The same smirk he wore at every family gathering when he knew he was the center of attention, the pride of the Coleman name. I expected nothing less. After all, Patrick was always the golden son, and this time would be no different. Or so I thought. When the doorbell rang, I didn't rush to answer it. Instead, I took my time finishing the dish I was preparing, grilled chicken with rosemary and garlic, the kind Richard had specifically requested the night before. I wanted to give them time. Time for Patrick to make his grand re-entry, and for his parents to shower him with adoration. Except that didn't happen. When I finally stepped into the living room, I found Patrick standing stiffly in the center of the room, looking mildly perturbed. His suitcase was still beside him, unopened. His parents were sitting on the couch, looking strangely disconnected. Richard's face was impassive as he rested against the cushion, clearly still stiff and sore from his recent fall. Eleanor was cradling her bandaged wrist, her posture tense but oddly quiet. There were no glowing smiles. No doting eyes. No proud exchanges of "look how successful he is." Instead, there was only polite indifference. Patrick cleared his throat. "Hey, Mom." "Hey, Dad." His voice was smooth and confident. As though he were the star player returning to a roaring crowd. "You're looking well." It was a lie. They weren't looking well, they were still pale and tired from their ordeal. But Patrick didn't seem to notice. His eyes were already scanning the room with a detached air, not once falling on the carefully arranged pillows I had fluffed every morning or the fresh-cut flowers I had placed on the table to brighten the house. He glanced at me briefly, and his lips quirked into a half-hearted smile. "Henry, thanks for helping out," he said casually. His tone was light. Dismissive. Patronizing. For a brief moment, the familiar bitterness stirred in my chest. The same bitterness I had swallowed countless times before. The same bitterness I felt every time Patrick walked into the room and was automatically seen as the better man, the more successful sibling, the more worthy son-in-law. But this time, I wasn't the one being dismissed. It was him. Richard and Eleanor barely reacted to his arrival. There was no outpouring of warmth, no affectionate questions about his business trip or his latest deal. Instead, Richard simply nodded once, clearly more interested in adjusting the heating pad beneath his hip than making small talk. Eleanor's smile was polite but hollow, and she didn't move to hug him. Patrick frowned slightly, clearly puzzled. He set his suitcase down with an awkward thump and tried again. "How are you both holding up?" he asked, his voice a bit louder, as if speaking more clearly would summon their usual enthusiasm. His father simply shrugged. "I've been better," Richard said flatly. His tone was devoid of the usual pride and affection he reserved for Patrick. There was no praise for his work, no admiration for his latest promotion. It was just a curt, disinterested response. Eleanor offered an equally lukewarm "we're managing." For the first time, Patrick's smile faltered slightly. He glanced at me, confused. His eyes narrowed, as if trying to figure out why the dynamic had shifted. He still hadn't realized it. He didn't realize that his absence had cost him his place in their eyes. That evening, the family gathered around the dinner table. I had made beef stew with roasted vegetables, Richard's favorite, and baked a warm apple pie from scratch. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and butter, a homey aroma that made the house feel warm and inviting, despite the storm rumbling softly outside. Patrick sat at the far end of the table, looking out of place. His usual charm seemed duller, less effective. His voice was a little louder than usual, his gestures a bit more exaggerated, as though he were trying to reclaim the spotlight that had subtly slipped from his grasp. "So, we closed a massive deal with a new client last week," Patrick announced, swirling his wine glass dramatically. "The commission alone was huge. Couldn't have timed it better." He glanced expectantly at Richard, clearly waiting for the usual nod of admiration or a rare word of fatherly pride. But Richard merely muttered, and spooned more vegetables onto his plate without looking up. Eleanor didn't ask for details. She didn't press him for specifics or beam at him with pride. She simply passed the salt shaker toward me and softly said, "Henry, the stew is absolutely perfect." She smiled at me, genuinely smiled. And in her eyes, I saw something I had never seen before, real appreciation. I glanced across the table at Patrick, whose jaw stiffened slightly. His eyes flicked between his parents and me, his confusion slowly morphing into annoyance. For once, he wasn't the golden boy. For once, he was simply irrelevant. The rest of the evening passed quietly. Patrick spoke less and less as the night went on, clearly sensing the subtle shift in the family dynamic. When he excused himself early, Claiming he had work calls to make, nobody protested. Nobody begged him to stay. After he left, I helped Eleanor clear the dishes. As I stood at the sink, rinsing the plates, she suddenly placed her hand lightly on my arm. I turned toward her, startled. "Henry," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. She struggled for a moment, searching for the right words. Finally, she met my eyes and whispered, "I don't know how to thank you for what you did." Her eyes shimmered with sincerity, raw and genuine. It wasn't the forced pleasantries she once offered or the stiff, disapproving glances. This was real. I simply smiled and shook my head. "You don't have to," I said gently. But she wasn't done. She pressed on, her voice trembling slightly. "We were wrong about you." Her eyes dropped briefly to the floor before meeting mine again. "I was wrong about you." The words, spoken so softly, carried more weight than any grand apology ever could. Later that night, as I helped Richard into bed, he gripped my wrist lightly before I could pull away. His fingers were thin and weak, but his grip was firm. "You're a good man, Henry," he said hoarsely, his eyes glassy with exhaustion. "I'll never forget this. Never." I swallowed against the unexpected lump in my throat. After I returned home, things were never the same again. At the next family gathering, Richard greeted me with a firm handshake and an earnest smile. Eleanor kissed me on the cheek. Their eyes were warmer, their words softer. When Lauren and I walked into the room, they welcomed me with open arms, not out of obligation, but out of genuine affection. And Patrick? He sat quietly in the corner, nursing his drink, watching the way his parents now gravitated toward me. No longer their golden child. No longer the son they paraded with pride. I never gloated. I never rubbed it in his face. I didn't need to. Because every time Richard clapped me on the back or Eleanor smiled at me with warmth, Patrick felt it. He felt the sting of their newfound respect for the man they once dismissed. And that was more satisfying than any revenge could ever be. And that was more satisfying than any revenge could ever be.